Hello and welcome to the garden. So today's video is all about the alliums. Now I've got 3 beds that I have filled with shallots, overwintering onions and garlic. They all went in the late autumn. Now they've been covered with a fine mesh, mostly to keep the birds off actually, rather than anything else, to prevent them from tugging on the young growth as it emerges and uprooting everything. So those covers can actually come off now, and I need to get in there and do a bit of weeding. So I'm going to take those covers off and see how everything's looking. Then I need to get some onion sets in. Now I wasn't going to plant any onion sets this year. I've already planted out some seed grown onions, and we'll take a little look at those and see how they're settling in as well. Of course, nothing's been growing particularly quickly in the last month or so because of the cold temperatures, but we'll have a look at those. It is getting a little bit late for the onion sets, and I know a lot of gardeners start their onion sets in cells, and that's quite a good idea because you can get those going in the protected environment of a greenhouse or a polytunnel and give them that head start. But I think the important thing with onion sets, the spring planting onion sets, is not to get them in the ground too soon. So if they get a sustained cold period, that can encourage them to bolt. So I've kind of been waiting until the worst of that cold weather has passed. So I think normally towards the end of March might be a good time to think about it, at least here in the south. I think if I was further north, I would also start them off in cells to give them a head start. I've never done that before here, and they've usually done okay. I think normally I'd be able to get them in the ground about 3 weeks earlier, and in a warm spring, maybe even 4 weeks ago. So last year I went a little bit overboard on the shallots, and I planted up, well, I've got 3 beds that are full, and there certainly shouldn't be more than 2, and ideally just 1.5 planted in the autumn. So I've made a bit of a mess of my planting scheme. One of the beds that was reserved for courgettes and sweet corn, things like that, that's full of shallots. So I'm going to have to put the sweet corn and the courgettes in a bed which should have the brassicas in. They're going to have to go somewhere else, and there's a knock-on effect where I've really made a bit of a mess of it. And for the first time ever, I'm actually running out of space and wondering where I'm going to put everything. So I really don't need to be planting any more onions. I don't know what I was thinking, but I have them, and I'm going to get some of them in the ground today. So first, a quick look at the leek seedlings. These are all growing really well actually. They're looking quite healthy and quite happy in here. There's quite a reasonable depth of soil in this tray, so I think that helps. And yeah, these are doing great. So these have got to grow on quite a bit yet though before they're ready to transplant. So under the netting here we have the onions that were sown from seed. Now they're not looking too bad. I've been quite worried about the condition of this soil here because it is rather compact, and I was wondering whether the onions would manage to get their roots down successfully. Well, some of them look as though they've established quite well, others not quite so good, so it's looking a little bit variable at the moment, and we'll have to wait and see what happens. Of course, it has been so cold that there's been relatively slow growth at the moment. Hopefully there's been some development underground and those roots are getting settled in despite the rather firm soil. I've got quite a mixture of varieties and clusters here, so some of these have been sown singly and some in small clumps of 2 or 3, and then more still that have been sown in larger clumps. So it's all quite a mixed bag in this bed, and it'll be interesting to see what performs best in this fairly compact border. I've never planted onions in the borders before, I reserve that normally for larger plants, but unfortunately, having gone over the top on shallots, I ran out of space in the normal vegetable bed, so they had to go in here. So the 3 beds here that are covered with the mesh, those are full of onions, garlic and shallots, and I'm going to get the covers off, and then I'll be able to take a closer look and see how everything is doing and get at some of the weeds that are growing here. So I've got those beds uncovered now, and I can get a good look at what's going on there. Now, one of the interesting things with shallots is the effect that the size of the bulb has on the number of offshoots and the eventual size of the bulbs that are produced. So you would be forgiven for imagining that the largest bulb is the best one to plant. I don't think that's necessarily the case, nor is the small one necessarily the best. What I like to plant is a bulb of modest proportions, not too big, not too small. And the reason is this, that a large bulb, impressive though it may be, tends to produce a great many offsets. And as a consequence, the bulbs that are produced, you'll get a lot of them, but they will be rather small. Whereas a smaller bulb will tend to divide into rather fewer plants. And with those, you tend to get the larger bulbs. And what you probably want is something somewhere in the middle. In the old days, they used to talk about 2 different sorts of shallot. There was the true shallot and the false shallot. Now, the true shallot, that was the eschalot gris, or the grey shallot, and the false shallot was what is sometimes known as a Jersey type. So that's your common brown-skinned sort of shallot. Now, I'm growing both of those here. I've got Longue de Bretagne, and that's doing very well. And then I've got some of the grey shallot. Now, if I show you first the Longue de Bretagne. Now, these were very good quality bulbs. Some of the nicest shallot bulbs I've seen. I don't think I've got any misses. There are 1 or 2, like this one over here, that's not looking brilliant, but I think pretty much everyone has gone through the winter, and it's been quite a harsh winter, reasonably well. Now, these are dividing nicely. They divide into anything from 3 or 4 up to maybe as many as 7 separate plants, and so I'm going to get a modest cluster of shallots from each one of these, and that's what I'm looking for. That's going to give me bulbs of a reasonable size. If you just get so many bulbs, they're going to be too small and fiddly to be of much use in the kitchen. So these are doing very nicely. This is one of the grey shallots, and these are just enormous. And this is split into, well, I won't even try to count it, but a great many new bulbs will be developing there. But I can't imagine that I'm going to get anything of great size from this plant. So when I received the shallot bulbs, I must confess I was rather disappointed. Not with the quality of the bulbs, because there were some dodgy ones, and they usually are. I had very few dodgy ones with the other shallots, but there were some that I had to discard of the grey shallot. But the problem for me was the huge difference in bulb sizes. Now you're paying by weight, so massive bulbs are not that helpful. They're not great to grow. They'd be wonderful in the kitchen, but they're not great ones to grow. And of course, they take up relatively quite a lot of that weight. So I wasn't happy with those. And right down the other end, I had some real tiddlers. And I'll pop up a picture of the sort of range of bulb sizes I received. So in this part of the bed that I've just shown you, That's where I planted the larger bulbs. So now I'll just show you what happened with the smaller ones. So the smaller bulbs, I think in the end, might actually do a little bit better. You can see that these have split into far fewer plants. I mean, this one only has, what, 3 or 4? And that seems to be quite common in here. I can see some with 4, others with 5 or so. So there's a good chance that I might get some larger bulbs from these. You might also observe that the growth from these smaller bulbs is not especially impressive. It looks a little bit weedy. So neither end of the spectrum is particularly ideal. This was a bulb that was probably of a reasonable size, and I think this one looks to be performing rather better. And similarly for its neighbour, that one does appear to be doing a little better, and that's the sort of bulb that I want to see. Apart from me being a bit pedantic about bulb size, I think the shallots are actually doing pretty well. There are few, if any, that haven't made it through the winter, so I'm actually quite happy with that. These are sensu yellow. These were also planted in the autumn, and I think they're doing pretty well. There's maybe one miss and one runty little fellow here, but by and large they all seem to be quite healthy and with pretty robust stems, so that is good to see at this stage. At this end of the plot we've got the garlic. Now the old leaves of course have been browned by the dry winds, and that's to be expected, but the rest of the growth looks pretty healthy, and I am very happy with the size of the stems here. This is pretty encouraging at this stage, and I'm hoping this is an indicator of some good sized garlic to come later in the year. Now I'm not sure if we've got any misses in this bed. I was very impressed with these bulbs when I planted them. They were large bulbs with large cloves, and that is ideal. So you can see why I'm running out of space here. I've got, I think, nearly 2 of these beds filled with shallots. And then with the rest of the garlic and the overwintering onions, there's 3 beds taken up. And I really shouldn't have more than maybe 1.5 at this stage. Well, we've got all sorts of weed in here, but one of the nice things about a no-dig bed, especially one like this where we don't walk on it, is that the weeds really do come out rather well. Unlike the borders, which have really heavy soil, the soil here is nice and light, and that makes weeding rather straightforward. So this spot I'm in at the moment, this is west facing. I think this is probably the prime location for the leeks, and I haven't counted how many I've got there, but I think I've got plenty enough to fill this whole space. So I'm going to earmark this for leeks, and this border faces almost north, but it does get some sun early morning and later in the day. It's probably not ideal for planting out some onions, but I've got nowhere better for them to go, so I think I'm going to make a space here for them, and I already have something to plant out along the edge here, so I will come in maybe 1 foot to 18 inches and then plant out a patch here. That is a shady corner, so I don't really want to use that for them. I've got some other stuff that I can put in that later in the year, but I think this is where I'm going to plant out some of the sets. So ordinarily I'm sort of a no-dig gardener, so the main veg beds we don't walk on them, we just cultivate them from the pathways wherever possible. It's very unusual for us to step on one of those beds, and we don't dig them. We just spread a layer of manure or compost on the surface and let the soil life deal with it. And that, for me at least, that's the ideal way of maintaining those beds. But the soil in the borders is a slightly different matter. Our soil tends to compact. It really does compact easily if it's walked on. The uncultivated parts of the garden, so outside of this fence, if you put a tree in the ground, its roots can barely penetrate the soil here. So when we first moved here, we had to take out a couple of poorly growing trees to make room for the kitchen garden. They weren't big established trees. I'd never remove a large tree, but they were small, wind-blown, runty specimens, and when we took them out, we found that their roots had never developed properly. So I think one of them was just swirling around in the planting hole and not able to get out, and the other one had run its roots along just under the grass and not got them down into the soil. That was the only place that was loose enough for it to run, and I think that's to do with the blend of particle sizes we've got. And this soil is quite sandy, but it's also got a lot of silt in and a lot of stone, and somehow we've got the right combination for binding together to make a really compact soil. Now, it's absolutely fine where we've been cultivating those other beds for years, and that soil's nice and light. But in the borders, that's not the case. Where I planted the seed-grown onions, that border is still very hard, and that's why I'm a bit worried about them. That is despite years of cultivation on that part and tons of organic matter. I think just because we walk on it and somehow that border has never developed the soil texture that the veg beds have. This border, up to this point, nothing's been grown in here, so this one hasn't had the benefit of any cultivation. So this soil, I think, is a little bit too firm for planting in the onion sets. I wouldn't be happy to try and set them out into here. In the other beds, the soil's so light, I can just push the sets into the compost, and that is great. So I'm going along here with the fork and I'm just loosening this up. As a broadly no-dig gardener, I'm kind of aware of the negative consequences of traditional digging. So I'm not trying to turn over the soil to muddle up the soil layers. I'm doing the minimum that I can get away with, really, in order to just fluff this up a little bit to relieve a little bit of the compaction. So I'm just jamming the fork in and giving it a little wiggle. I'm not turning it over or anything like that. Now, I'm not funny about digging. There are lots of gardens which are managed with traditional winter digging, and great crops can be grown in that way. So I don't have a problem with actual digging. And there are times when I will dig something over when it's necessary, whether that's to get perennial weed roots out, or when the soil is just compact, or I need for some reason to cultivate it more deeply. But wherever possible now, I like to disturb the soil as little as possible, and that's for the soil's benefit, I think, as well as mine. So hopefully all this needs now is just a bit of a rake over. I'll break up any large clods. Oh, as you can see, we've got worms in here. It's not that there's no activity in this soil. It's just something about the nature of the soil lends itself to compaction. This is something I think wouldn't be necessary on a great many soils, but it's something we need to take care of here. And of course we've got a usual quantity of stone. I don't think that could be mistaken for a fine tilth exactly. This would still be rather lumpy to sow in directly, but I think that's absolutely fine now for setting out the onions. So the variety I have here is Sturon, just kind of a classic yellow onion, very commonly available as sets. Now I've gone through the sets. I've picked out any that are particularly small and a few of the larger bulbs. So I've picked out those that are of a sort of modest size, and I've made sure that they're all firm and there's no mold or anything. Now, if your ground is quite hard, as this was before I worked it over, it's well worth making a hole for these and dropping them in. But if the ground is soft, certainly as it is in our main vegetable beds, and hopefully it'll be soft enough here now, you can just push these in. But you don't want to push these in with great force, because you may damage the plate there at the bottom where the roots are developing or will develop. So these want to be set so that just the tip is showing above the soil level. As for spacing, well, I think ordinarily I'd probably put these in at about 5 inches. I think that's what I did for the overwintering onions, but these are going in a little bit late, and I don't know how well they're going to do in this particular border, so I think I'm going to put these in at about 4 inches apart. So I've got a tape on the ground there to keep me on track, and I'll just set these out and then I'll go over and push them in. So having laid them out at roughly 4 inches apart, all I need to do now is just push them down into the soil, leaving just the tip showing. Now, if the soil's a little bit firm, I will just make a hole with my finger. You could use a dibber. Just don't want to damage the basal plate. So I've just covered them there with a little bit of mesh, and that's just to keep the birds off for now. I just had the mesh handy. Netting or anything would be fine, just to stop the birds giving them a tug while they're getting established. As soon as they've got their roots down into the soil, then I can take that off and they'll be fine. Just one small job left to do. So I had a few spare bulbs and I've just set them out into some cells just in case one or two of the others fail to come through. It's always nice to have a few spares, and I suppose if all of those come good, I might try and find somewhere to put those in, but I'm really running out of space now. So apart from transplanting the leeks later in the year, that's pretty much it for the alliums. Just need to keep the beds weeded. So that is it for this video. Thanks ever so much for watching, and bye for now.